Hey guys, in tonight's mystery, we present the Great Emu War of Australia, a strange moment in history when the Australian military waged war against a horde of flightless birds and lost. It's one of those stories that leaves more questions than answers. And tonight, you'll hear it all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, lie back, listen closely, and drift off as the mystery unfolds. You settle into your favorite reading chair, a warm cup of tea steaming beside you as we journey back to Western Australia in 1932. Picture yourself as a newly appointed government clerk, fresh from the city, with ink-stained fingers and a head full of bureaucratic procedures. Your boss, a mustached fellow who smells perpetually of pipe tobacco, has just handed you the most unusual assignment of your career. Right then, he says, sliding a manila folder across your desk like it contains state secrets. We've got a bit of a situation out in Campion and Walgoolan. The farmers are, well, they're requesting military assistance. You flip open the folder, expecting to read about drought relief or perhaps equipment repairs. Instead, your eyes widen at the official request. Emergency deployment needed to combat large-scale agricultural threat. The threat, according to the meticulously typed report, involves approximately 20,000 emus. Now, you've seen emus at the zoo, those lanky, prehistoric-looking birds with expressions that suggest they know something you don't. But 20,000 of them? That sounds less like a farming problem and more like something out of a fever dream after too much Christmas pudding. Your task is deliciously straightforward. Investigate the legitimacy of this request and determine whether the Australian military should indeed declare war on a flock of birds. As you lean back in your creaky office chair, you can't help but wonder how exactly one goes about conducting reconnaissance on emus. The next morning finds you on a train heading west, watching the landscape transform from suburban gardens to endless wheat fields. Your traveling companion is a weathered farmer named Bill Mackenzie, who's been summoned to provide testimony about what the newspapers have started calling the emu situation. Started about 6 months ago, Bill explains, settling into the train seat with the careful movements of someone whose back has seen too many harvests. First, we thought it was just a few strays from the usual migration. Then more showed up. Then more after that. Before we knew it, the whole countryside was lousy with the things. You pull out your notebook. A proper investigator always carries a notebook and jot down the timeline. But as Bill continues his story, you realize this isn't just about crop damage. There's something almost orchestrated about the way these emus have descended upon the wheat belt, as if they've planned the whole operation. The strange bit, Bill continues, lowering his voice conspiratorially, is how they move. They do not move randomly, as birds typically do. They've got patterns, routes, almost like they're following orders. The train rocks gently on its tracks, and you find yourself sketching little emus in the margins of your notebook. Could birds really be that organized? Or was there something else at play here? Something that would explain why thousands of 6-foot-tall birds had suddenly decided to wage their war against Australian agriculture. As the afternoon sun streams through the train windows, creating long shadows that cover your notes, you realize this investigation might be more complex than anyone imagined. The farmers want military intervention, but first, you need to understand exactly what you're dealing with. After all, how do you solve a mystery when your primary suspects are flightless birds with attitudes and the collective intelligence of a parliamentary committee? The gentle rumble of the train wheels seems to whisper possibilities as you drift into contemplation, wondering what secrets await in the wheat fields ahead. Dawn greets you as you arrive in Campion, and the eerie quiet overwhelms you immediately. Usually, farm towns awaken to the sound of roosters crowing and dogs barking, but this morning's silence feels muffled, as if the landscape itself is retaining its breath. Bill Mackenzie leads you down a dirt road toward his property, pointing out details you might have missed. See those tracks there? He indicates a series of three-toed prints in the dusty earth, each one roughly the size of your palm. Fresh from last night, they come through after dark now, like they know we're watching during the day. You kneel beside the tracks, pulling out a measuring tape with the serious dedication of a Scotland Yard detective. The prints form neat single-file lines, stretching toward the wheat fields like a prehistoric conga line. But what catches your attention isn't the size or number of tracks, it's how deliberately spaced they are. These aren't the chaotic scratches of panicked birds fleeing predators. They're methodical, almost military in their precision. Your investigation leads you to Harold Ferguson's farm, where the damage assessment begins in earnest. Harold, a man whose sun-weathered face tells the story of 40 years working this land, walks you through what remains of his wheat crop. The destruction is impressive in its thoroughness. Not the random munching you'd expect from hungry birds, but systematic stripping that follows the property lines with suspicious accuracy. It's like they've got a map, Harold mutters, kicking at a pile of wheat stubble. They know exactly where my land ends and Peterson's begins. Peterson's crop, hardly touched. Mine might as well have been harvested by a combine. You make notes about this selectivity, wondering if emus could possibly distinguish between different farmers' properties. The rational part of your mind suggests it's probably about soil conditions or wheat varieties, but there's something unsettling about the precision of it all. As the morning progresses, you begin to notice other peculiarities. The local dogs, normally eager to chase anything that moves, seem reluctant to venture near areas where emu tracks are heaviest. The horses in nearby paddocks cluster together at the far ends of their fields, ears pricked forward, watching the wheat with nervous energy. Your official government camera, a bulky contraption that requires considerable setup time, captures image after image of the evidence: trampled crops, scattered feathers, and those unnervingly organized tracks. But when you develop the film that evening in the makeshift darkroom at the local hotel, you discover something odd in the photographs. In several shots, you can make out distant shapes at the edges of the wheat fields. The dark silhouettes, which could be emus, appear to be standing in formation. Not the loose clusters you'd expect from foraging birds, but actual lines, like soldiers awaiting orders. The rational explanation is that it's a trick of light and shadow, but the pattern appears in multiple photographs taken from different angles. That night, as you review your notes by lamplight, a thought occurs to you that seems almost too ridiculous to consider seriously. What if the emu's behavior isn't random at all? What if there's some form of communication or coordination happening that goes beyond normal animal instincts? You set down your pen and listen to the sounds drifting through your hotel window. In the distance, you can hear them. Low, rumbling calls that seem to echo back and forth across the wheat fields like some primitive telegraph system. The calls have rhythm and pattern, almost like a conversation being conducted in a language you can't understand. Tomorrow, you decide, you'll need to observe the emus directly. But tonight, as you drift off to sleep with the mysterious calling echoing in your ears, you can't shake the feeling that you're investigating something far more complex than a simple agricultural pest problem. The emus, it seems, might just be smarter than anyone gave them credit for. Your morning brings an unexpected development: the arrival of Major G.P.W. Meredith, a professional soldier tasked with leading what everyone has started calling, with varying degrees of seriousness, the military operation. You find him at the local pub, studying maps over a breakfast of eggs and black coffee, looking like a man who's been asked to plan the invasion of Normandy but has only been given a slingshot. Major Meredith possesses the kind of military bearing that suggests he's accustomed to clear objectives and straightforward enemies. Watching him trace his finger along topographical lines while muttering about target acquisition and engagement parameters provides a delightful contrast to the reality of his situation. His enemy, after all, stands 6 feet tall, can run 30 miles per hour, and has the strategic advantage of not caring about military protocol. The challenge, he explains to you over his second cup of coffee, is that conventional tactics assume your opponent will behave in conventional ways. These birds, he pauses, choosing his words carefully, they don't seem to follow the usual patterns. You share your observations from the previous days, including the photographs showing what appear to be organized formations. Major Meredith examines them with the intense focus of a general studying enemy troop movements, which, you realize, is essentially what he's doing. "Interesting," he murmurs, pointing to one particularly clear image. "See how they're positioned? That's not random foraging, that's perimeter security." He looks up at you with the expression of someone who's just realized his job has become significantly more complicated. "I think we may be dealing with an opponent that's considerably more sophisticated than anticipated." Your investigation takes a fascinating turn when the Major suggests a joint reconnaissance mission. Armed with binoculars, notebooks, and what he optimistically calls tactical snacks, you venture into the field for direct observation of enemy operations. The first emu encounter occurs around mid-morning when you crest a small hill and find yourself looking down at approximately 50 birds methodically working their way through Harold Ferguson's wheat. But what you observe defies every assumption about random animal behavior. The emus have organized themselves into a clear hierarchy. Larger birds patrol the perimeter while smaller groups work systematically through the crop rows. When one of the perimeter guards spots your observation party, it doesn't flee or sound a general alarm. Instead, it makes a specific call, 3 short, sharp notes, and the entire group executes what can only be described as a tactical withdrawal. They don't run in panic. They don't scatter in all directions. They regroup at a predetermined rally point approximately 200 yards away, where they turn and observe you with the patient attention of professionals evaluating potential threats. "Good Lord," Major Meredith whispers, lowering his binoculars slowly. "They've got discipline." Your notes from this encounter read more like a military intelligence briefing than a wildlife observation report. The EMUs demonstrate clear command structure, coordinated movement, and what appears to be advanced planning. When the Major suggests moving to a different observation point, the birds anticipate the maneuver and adjust their positions accordingly. But the most unsettling discovery comes during lunch, when you notice something that makes you question whether you're dealing with simple animal behavior at all. While you and the Major share sandwiches behind a windbreak of eucalyptus trees, you observe a single emu approach from the direction of Peterson's untouched farm. This bird, clearly different from the others due to a distinctive pattern of darker feathers around its head, surveys the wheat field where the morning's group had been feeding. It walks the perimeter in a precise clockwise pattern, pausing at regular intervals to examine the ground. Then, in a behavior that raises the hair on the back of your neck, it begins making calls. The calls are not random emu noises. Instead, they follow a specific sequence: 2 long calls, a pause, 3 short calls, another pause, and then the pattern repeats. Within minutes, birds begin emerging from the wheat in response to what can only be described as a recall signal. Major Meredith has gone hushed beside you. When you glance at him, his expression suggests he's just realized that his military training might actually be relevant to this assignment after all. "Well," he says, finally, packing up the remains of lunch with deliberate precision, "this certainly changes the tactical situation. The next phase of your investigation requires more sophisticated surveillance techniques. Major Meredith, drawing upon his military experience, suggests establishing observation posts at strategic locations around the affected farms. You discover yourself crouched behind a water tank at dawn, equipped with field glasses, and a growing sense that this assignment has evolved far beyond simple agricultural assessment. The observations you make over the next few days will challenge the credibility of anyone who hasn't personally experienced them. The emus operate with a level of coordination that seems to mock every assumption about bird behavior. They conduct their crop raids with the precision of a well-drilled unit, posting sentries, rotating feeding groups, and maintaining communication through a complex system of calls and visual signals. Your detailed log entries begin to read like intelligence reports from some surreal military campaign. 0630 hours. Enemy scouts conduct a perimeter sweep of the Ferguson property. 0645. Main force advances in 3-column formation. 0700. Systematic harvesting begins, proceeding north to south in organized strips. But the most remarkable discovery comes when you realize the emus have developed countermeasures specifically designed to deal with human observation. On the third day of surveillance, you notice they have begun posting guards specifically to watch for human activity. When Major Meredith attempts to establish a new observation post, the EMUs adjust their patterns to account for the new position. "They're learning," the Major observes, making notes in his field journal. "Every time we change our tactics, they adapt theirs. It's like playing chess with an opponent who's getting better at the game." Your investigation takes an unexpected turn when you decide to interview Mrs. Dorothy Peterson, whose farm has remained mysteriously untouched despite being surrounded by devastated properties. Dorothy, a practical woman with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who's spent decades dealing with the challenges of rural life, provides information that adds another layer to the puzzle. "Started about a week before the big raids," she explains, serving tea in china cups that seem delightfully incongruous given the circumstances. "A single bird would come by every morning, always the same one, big fellow with dark patches around the head. The bird would walk along the fence line, inspecting its surroundings before moving on. You lean forward with interest. Always the same bird? Oh yes, definitely the same one. Had a distinctive limp in the left leg. Would spend maybe 20 minutes checking the property, then head off toward the Ferguson place. Never touched anything, mind you. Just seemed to be surveying." This intelligence proves crucial to understanding the scope of the operation. The emus aren't simply responding to available food sources, they're conducting systematic reconnaissance and planning their operations accordingly. The deliberate avoidance of Mrs. Peterson's property implies that they are making strategic decisions based on factors you haven't yet identified. As you attempt to map emu movement patterns and predict their next targets, your evening analysis sessions with Major Meredith become increasingly complex. The Major approaches the problem with the methodical precision of someone trained in military intelligence, creating charts and diagrams that would look perfectly at home in a war room. "Look at this pattern," he says, pointing to a map marked with colored pins representing different types of emu activity. They're not just raiding randomly, they're systematically working from the most isolated properties toward the more populated areas. It's a classic campaign strategy. Secure your flanks before advancing toward your primary objectives. The implications are both fascinating and slightly unnerving. You're not dealing with simple pest animals acting on instinct. You're observing what appears to be a coordinated campaign conducted by opponents capable of learning, adapting, and planning operations with remarkable sophistication. As you prepare your preliminary report for the bureaucrats back in the city, you discover yourself facing a unique challenge. How do you explain to government officials that the agricultural crisis they're dealing with may actually be the result of strategic action by an enemy force that happens to be composed entirely of large, flightless birds? The gentle evening sounds of the countryside, crickets chirping, wind rustling through wheat stubble, provide a peaceful backdrop for contemplating one of the most unusual military intelligence briefs in Australian history. Major Meredith's military equipment arrives on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a bemused supply sergeant who clearly questions the wisdom of deploying Lewis machine guns against agricultural pests. You watch as the Major methodically inspects his arsenal. 2 Lewis guns, ammunition, and various support equipment that seems impressively professional for what everyone still insists on calling pest control. The absurdity of the situation becomes apparent as you help establish the first firing position. Here's a decorated military officer applying genuine tactical principles to engage an enemy force of emus who have been systematically outmaneuvering attempts at conventional wildlife management. The Lewis gun, designed to stop German infantry advances, now points toward a wheat field where your feathered opponents are conducting their morning operations. The key, Major Meredith explains, adjusting the weapon's position with professional precision, is achieving effective target engagement while accounting for the enemy's mobility and tactical awareness. He pauses, seeming to realize how this sounds. "I never thought I'd be applying suppressing fire doctrine to birds." Your role in this operation has evolved from bureaucratic investigator to something resembling a military intelligence officer. You've developed detailed profiles of EMU behavior patterns, identified what appear to be leadership figures within their groups, and created tactical assessments that Major Meredith treats with the seriousness usually reserved for enemy troop movements. The first engagement occurs on a crisp Wednesday morning when a group of approximately 40 EMUs begins their systematic advance across Harold Ferguson's remaining wheat crop. Major Meredith positions his Lewis gun with careful attention to fields of fire and potential escape routes, while you serve as a spotter, tracking enemy movement through field glasses. Range approximately 300 yards, you report, feeling simultaneously ridiculous and genuinely engaged in the tactical problem. The main body of enemy forces is advancing in column formation with scouts deployed on the flanks. The major opens fire with short, controlled bursts, applying textbook machine gun techniques to a target unlike anything in military training manuals. The results are unexpected. Rather than scattering in panic, the EMUs execute what can only be described as a tactical withdrawal. They don't flee randomly. They bound away in coordinated groups, maintaining formation discipline while moving at speeds that quickly carry them beyond effective range. Fascinating, Major Meredith mutters, making notes in his field journal. They've adapted their response to account for the weapon's characteristics. They're staying mobile and using their superior speed to maintain standoff distance. Over the following days, your joint military operation becomes an increasingly complex game of tactical adaptation. The EMUs, demonstrating remarkable learning ability, adjust their behavior to minimize exposure to the Lewis guns. They begin approaching target areas from directions that offer the best cover and concealment, time their raids to coincide with periods when observation is most difficult, and maintain security measures that would impress professional military instructors. Your daily intelligence briefings with Major Meredith take on an almost surreal quality as you analyze enemy countermeasures and develop new tactical approaches. The EMUs have begun using decoy operations, sending small groups to distract attention while their main forces conduct raids elsewhere. They have learned to identify the sound signature of the Lewis guns and can execute immediate suppression responses when they hear the distinctive mechanical cycling. They're getting better at these tasks faster than we are, the Major admits during one evening planning session. Every engagement teaches them something new about our capabilities and limitations. Meanwhile, we're still trying to figure out how to fight an enemy that can run 30 miles per hour and isn't concerned about conventional military doctrine. The situation reaches a new level of complexity when you discover that the EMUs have begun conducting night reconnaissance of your positions. Evidence suggests they're scouting your defensive arrangements and adjusting their operations accordingly. The tracks around your firing positions tell a story of systematic intelligence gathering by opponents who are taking the tactical situation seriously. As you settle into your evening routine of updating intelligence reports and planning tomorrow's operations, you can't help but appreciate the strange elegance of the situation. You're engaged in a genuine military campaign, complete with tactical planning, intelligence analysis, and operational adjustments, all directed against an enemy force composed entirely of large, surprisingly sophisticated birds who seem determined to prove that conventional military thinking has its limitations. The soft evening sounds of the Australian countryside provide a peaceful backdrop for what may be one of the most unusual campaigns in military history. By the end of the first week, it becomes clear that the Great Emu War has evolved into something unprecedented in military history. A sustained campaign between professional soldiers and an enemy force that learns and adapts with disturbing efficiency. Your daily intelligence summaries read like dispatches from some parallel universe where the rules of conventional warfare have been rewritten by opponents who can't read the manual. Major Meredith approaches the challenge with admirable professional dedication, treating each engagement as a learning opportunity rather than a simple pest control operation. His tactical notebooks fill with observations that would seem absurd in any other context, but make perfect sense given the circumstances. They've begun using terrain masking, he explains, during your morning briefing, pointing to a map marked with emu movement patterns. See how they approach from dead ground here and here? They're staying below ridgelines until the last possible moment, then using their speed to close distance before we can achieve effective target engagement. Your role has expanded to include what amounts to enemy psychological profiling. You've identified individual EMUs within the various groups, tracked their behavioral patterns, and developed assessments of their apparent decision-making processes. The bird with the distinctive dark head markings has emerged as a clear leadership figure, consistently appearing at the front of operations and seeming to coordinate group movements through specific call patterns. The tactical situation reaches new complexity when the EMUs begin demonstrating what can only be described as operational security measures. They've started varying their approach routes, timing their operations to avoid predictable patterns, and employing what appears to be counter-surveillance techniques when they suspect observation. Look at this morning's track analysis, you report, spreading aerial photographs across the planning table. They approached the Ferguson property from 3 different directions simultaneously, converged at a predetermined rally point, then withdrew using entirely different routes. That's not instinctive behavior, that's tactical planning. Major Meredith studies the evidence with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a military puzzle that doesn't appear in any training manual. They're applying principles of dispersed operations and multiple ingress routes. Whoever's coordinating their activities understands basic tactical doctrine. The Lewis gun engagements become increasingly sophisticated as both sides adapt to each other's capabilities. The EMUs develop techniques for approaching firing positions from unexpected angles, using natural cover to mask their movements and maintaining communication during contact. Meanwhile, Major Meredith adjusts his deployment patterns, varies his firing positions, and attempts to predict enemy approach routes based on terrain analysis. Your joint operations begin to resemble a complex military exercise more than agricultural pest control. You establish observation posts, conduct reconnaissance patrols, and maintain communication protocols that would be entirely appropriate for conventional military operations. The fact that your opponents are 6-foot-tall birds adds surreal elements but doesn't diminish the genuine tactical challenges involved. The breakthrough in understanding comes during your analysis of a particularly complex engagement near the Peterson property boundary. The EMUs demonstrate coordinated movement that suggests not just individual intelligence but collective problem-solving ability. When Major Meredith attempts to establish crossfire between 2 Lewis gun positions, the birds execute a flanking maneuver that effectively neutralizes his tactical advantage. They're not just learning, you realize, studying the movement patterns recorded in your field notes. They're teaching each other. Look at how the younger birds follow specific movement patterns established by the experienced ones. They're passing tactical knowledge through the group. This discovery adds an entirely new dimension to the campaign. You're not just dealing with intelligent opponents, you're facing an enemy force capable of institutional learning and knowledge transfer. Their collective tactical doctrine incorporates the lessons they learn from each engagement. As the sun sets on another day of this extraordinary campaign, you find yourself documenting what may be the first recorded instance of interspecies military conflict where both sides employ genuine tactical thinking. Your evening reports to the bureaucrats back in the city struggle to convey the complexity of the situation without sounding like the ravings of someone who spent too much time in the sun. The gentle evening sounds of the countryside, now familiar background noise to your strange military adventure, provide a peaceful contrast to the tactical complexity of your daytime operations. 3 weeks into the operation, the tactical situation has reached what military theorists would recognize as strategic deadlock. The EMUs have proven remarkably successful at achieving their operational objectives while minimizing their exposure to effective countermeasures. Major Meredith's ammunition expenditure reports make for fascinating reading. Hundreds of rounds fired, minimal enemy casualties, and a growing respect for opponents who have consistently outmaneuvered conventional military tactics. Your final intelligence assessment reads like a professional military evaluation of a peer competitor force. The EMUs have shown advanced teamwork skills, smart strategies, and security practices that have successfully countered most traditional military efforts. they've achieved their strategic objectives, access to agricultural resources, while maintaining force integrity and operational flexibility. The fundamental issue, Major Meredith explains during your final briefing, is that we're applying conventional military doctrine against an unconventional opponent operating in their preferred environment. They possess superior mobility, intimate knowledge of local terrain, and tactical flexibility that allows them to disengage at will. The recommendation you prepare for the government bureaucrats represents a unique document in military history. A formal assessment concluding that continued military operations against EMU forces would be tactically inadvisable and strategically counterproductive. The EMUs have essentially won through superior adaptation and the inherent advantages of operating on home territory against opponents constrained by conventional military thinking. Your journey back to the city provides time to reflect on the broader implications of your extraordinary assignment. You've participated in what may be the only military campaign in history where the human forces learned more than they taught. The EMUs demonstrated that intelligence, adaptability, and tactical thinking aren't limited to traditionally defined military forces. The final report you submit becomes something of a legend within government circles, a professionally written military assessment that recommends strategic withdrawal from operations against an enemy force of agricultural birds. The bureaucrats who originally assigned this investigation struggle to process recommendations that treat EMU tactical capabilities with the same seriousness usually reserved for human military opponents. Major Meredith returns to conventional military duties, but his tactical notebooks from the EMU campaign become unofficial, required reading for officers interested in unconventional warfare and adaptive enemy behavior. His professional assessment credits the EMUs with demonstrating tactical innovations that have applications for human military doctrine. Years later, as you've advanced through various government positions, colleagues occasionally ask about that business with the EMUs. You've learned to provide brief, factual summaries that avoid dwelling on the more extraordinary aspects of the campaign. Most people prefer to think of it as an amusing footnote about Australian wildlife management rather than a genuine military operation with tactical lessons for professional soldiers. But sometimes, during quiet evening moments, you return to those detailed field notes and tactical assessments. The Great Emu War represents something unique in military history, a campaign where unconventional opponents proved that intelligence and adaptability matter more than traditional advantages in equipment and training. The EMUs, for their part, achieved their strategic objectives and maintained control of their operational area. They demonstrated that effective military thinking isn't limited to humans, and that conventional doctrine has limitations when applied against opponents who don't acknowledge conventional rules. As you settle into your evening routine, perhaps with a warm cup of tea and the satisfaction of having documented one of history's most unusual military campaigns, you can appreciate the strange elegance of the entire situation. The Great Emu War proved that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. The gentle sounds of a peaceful evening provide the perfect backdrop for reflecting on a time when the Australian military learned to respect the tactical capabilities of large flightless birds who approached warfare with the seriousness of professional soldiers and the adaptability of natural strategists. You've probably heard the name whispered in documentaries or stumbled across it in some late-night internet rabbit hole, the Mary Celeste. The name Mary Celeste resonates effortlessly, doesn't it? However, this evening, as you find comfort in your preferred chair with perhaps a cup of tea cooling on the side table, let us embark on a journey into one of the ocean's most captivating mysteries. Picture yourself on December 5th, 1872, somewhere between Portugal and the Azores. The Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction, looking like rumpled blue silk under a winter sky. You're aboard the Dei Gratia, and frankly, it's been a rather boring voyage so far. Captain David Morehouse has been grumbling about the weather, the crew's been playing cards with increasing desperation, and you've read the same book 3 times. This kind of tedium makes you appreciate the fact that Netflix has not yet been invented. Then something catches your eye on the horizon. The ship is in motion, resembling an inebriated individual struggling to maintain a straight path. Her sails are set oddly, flapping in ways that would make any sailor wince. It's the maritime equivalent of watching someone wear a shirt inside out, technically functional, but obviously wrong. As you draw closer, you realize the problem isn't just poor seamanship. This is the Mary Celeste, a merchant brigantine that should be sailing purposefully toward Italy with a cargo hold full of denatured alcohol. Instead, she's drifting like a lost shopping cart in a parking lot, responding to wind and current with the enthusiasm of someone who's given up on GPS. Captain Morehouse knows this ship. He had dinner with Captain Benjamin Briggs just days before both vessels left New York. They'd shared stories, complained about the price of good rope, and probably argued about whether the weather would hold. Now here's Briggs's ship, sailing herself like some maritime autopilot experiment gone wrong. The boarding party you join moves carefully across the gangplank. There's something unsettling about stepping onto a ship that should have people but doesn't. It resembles entering a home where the coffee pot remains warm, yet no one responds to your calls. The deck is wet, but not from rain, from waves that have been washing over her bow unchecked. Below deck, the mystery deepens in ways that would make Agatha Christie jealous. The cargo is mostly intact, though some barrels of alcohol have leaked, creating a smell that's part industrial accident, part questionable cocktail party. Personal belongings are scattered, but not ransacked. It's as if everyone simply decided to step out for a moment and forgot to come back. The captain's cabin tells a particularly odd story. Charts are rolled neatly. The logbook sits open to an entry from November 25th, 10 days ago, recording their position near Santa Maria Island. The captain's wife's sewing kit is open, needle still threaded, as if she'd paused mid-stitch to answer a door that never opened. There's a half-finished letter on the desk, the ink not even fully dry, stopping mid-sentence like a conversation interrupted by something urgent. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. There's no sign of struggle, no evidence of piracy, and no indication of panic. The ship's papers are missing, which is odd because pirates typically care more about cargo than paperwork. The single lifeboat is gone, but the davits that held it show signs of hasty but deliberate lowering, not desperate cutting. You find yourself standing in the galley, looking at a pot of porridge that's gone cold and moldy. Someone had been cooking breakfast. Someone had been planning to eat it. Someone had been living their perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when something happened that made them leave everything behind. Let's discuss the folks who should have been aboard, because understanding who disappeared makes the mystery feel less like a ghost story and more like a very strange human drama. Captain Benjamin Briggs wasn't some mysterious figure. He was a seasoned mariner from a family of seafaring people, the kind of man who probably knew more knots than your average Boy Scout leader and could predict weather by sniffing the air. Briggs had brought his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia on this voyage. This wasn't unusual for merchant captains of the era. Ships were often floating family homes, especially on longer journeys. Sarah was an experienced sailor's wife who could probably splice rope better than most landlubbers and certainly knew her way around a ship's galley. Little Sophia, according to letters Sarah had written to relatives, was just beginning to walk and had apparently developed a toddler's fascination with trying to eat everything she found on deck. The crew was small but competent, 7 men who'd signed on for what should have been a routine voyage to Genoa. First mate Albert Richardson was German-born, but had been sailing American ships for years. The cook, Edward Head, was apparently notorious for his creative interpretations of salt pork recipes, though whether his fame was in a good way or bad way depends on which maritime memoir you believe. The curious thing about this particular group is how ordinary they were. No mysterious passengers with shady pasts, no crew members fleeing from the law, and no cargo that might attract pirates or government agents. Just a family and some working sailors transporting industrial alcohol from New York to Italy, the 1872 equivalent of hauling cleaning supplies across the country. But as you explore their abandoned quarters, you start to notice the small details that make them human. Sarah's dress is laid out neatly on the bed, as if she planned to wear it the next day. There's a child's toy tucked under a blanket in the corner, a small wooden horse with wheels, the kind any father might whittle during evening watches. In the crew's quarters, you find letters from home, some in German, others in broken English, all expressing the universal homesickness of people far from familiar places. The ship's manifest tells you they'd loaded 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol in New York. This wasn't drinking alcohol, it was industrial stuff, poisonous if consumed, used for manufacturing, the kind of cargo that was valuable but not particularly exciting to anyone except accountants and factory owners. Hardly the sort of thing that inspires dramatic mutinies or attracts colourful pirates. What strikes you most is how the personal items are arranged. If there had been panic, you'd expect chaos. If there had been pirates, you'd expect theft. Instead, everything suggests people who left with intention, but also with haste. Sarah's jewelry is still in its box, but her coat is missing from its hook. The ship's chronometer is gone, essential for navigation, but other valuable instruments remain. Standing in the captain's quarters, you can almost imagine the conversation that might have preceded their departure. Perhaps Briggs noticed something troubling about the cargo. The fumes could be dangerous on a wooden ship. Perhaps he noticed an approaching storm that concerned him. Perhaps little Sophia had come down with something and needed immediate attention that couldn't wait for port. The last entry in the ship's log, written in Briggs's careful handwriting, simply notes their position and the weather conditions. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. These are merely the routine observations of a professional mariner performing his duties. It's the maritime equivalent of someone's last text message being about grocery lists, perfectly mundane until you realize it's the last thing they ever wrote. You find yourself wondering about their last meal together, their last normal moment before whatever happened. Did little Sophia play with her wooden horse that morning? Did Sarah finish mending whatever she'd been sewing? Did Captain Briggs look at his charts and feel confident about the day ahead? Now comes the fun part, the part where everyone becomes a detective and the theories multiply like rabbits in a particularly fertile meadow. Over the years, people have proposed explanations for the Mary Celeste's empty state that range from plausible to wonderfully ridiculous, and honestly, some of the ridiculous ones are more entertaining than most television shows. Let's start with the piracy theory, because it's the most obvious and also the most problematic. Pirates in 1872 were generally practical business people. They wanted cargo, money, and anything else they could sell quickly. They weren't particularly interested in kidnapping entire families and crews for no apparent reason, especially when said families included a 2-year-old who would presumably require constant attention and contribute nothing to piratical enterprises. Furthermore, the Mary Celeste's cargo was still largely intact, which suggests either the world's most polite pirates or perhaps no pirates at all. The mutiny theory has similar problems. Typically, mistreatment, underpayment, or truly awful conditions lead to mutinies among crews. Captain Briggs, by all accounts, was a decent employer who paid fair wages and didn't run his ship like a floating prison. His crew had signed on willingly and had no particular reason to revolt. Even if they had mutinied, what would they do with the captain's wife and toddler? It's not like mutineers typically find themselves equipped with a good childcare plan. Then there's the alcohol fume theory, which actually has some merit. The cargo hold contained 9 barrels that had leaked, creating potentially explosive fumes in an enclosed space. Imagine the smell of nail polish remover mixed with the exhaust from a paint factory, all concentrated in a wooden box floating on the ocean. If Captain Briggs had suspected the danger of explosion or fire, he might have ordered everyone into the lifeboat as a temporary measure, planning to return once the danger passed. This theory has the advantage of explaining the orderly departure as panic, just prudent seamanship. The lifeboat might have been intended to stay nearby while the ship aired out. Unfortunately, if a storm came up or the tow line broke, the lifeboat could have been separated from the ship, leaving the Mary Celeste to sail on alone, while its passengers and crew faced the Atlantic in a boat designed for emergencies, not extended voyaging. Weather could have played a role too. Sudden, violent storms are known to appear without much warning in the area where the Mary Celeste was located. Perhaps Briggs saw something approaching that made him decide to abandon ship temporarily, only to have the weather separate them permanently from their vessel. It's the maritime equivalent of stepping out of your car to check the engine and having the car somehow drive away without you. Some theories venture into more exotic territory. Sudden tidal waves can be triggered by underwater earthquakes. Giant squids could launch dramatic attacks, potentially leaving behind signs of tentacle-induced chaos. Encounters with other vessels, which somehow manage to whisk away the entire population without disturbing the cargo or leaving witnesses, have also been reported. The truly creative theories involve everything from time warps to alien abduction to spontaneous dimensional shifts. While these make for excellent late-night conversation starters, they have the disadvantage of being completely unprovable and requiring the laws of physics to take an extended coffee break. Theories are annoying because they explain some parts of the mystery, but not others. The alcohol fume theory explains the orderly departure, but not why the ship continued sailing in a straight line. The weather theory explains the separation, but not the missing ship's papers. The piracy theory explains the missing people, but not the intact cargo. Standing on the empty deck, you realize that the Mary Celeste's greatest mystery might not be what happened, but why it happened so completely. Whatever occurred, it convinced 10 people, including a cautious sea captain and a mother with a small child, to leave a perfectly seaworthy vessel for the uncertain safety of a small lifeboat. That's not a decision anyone makes lightly. Walking through the Mary Celeste now, you become something of a forensic detective, reading the story the ship tells through 1,000 small details. Ships, like houses, hold on to the echoes of the people who live in them, and this one is practically chattering with evidence if you know how to listen. The galley holds particularly intriguing clues. The stove is cold, but there are dishes that suggest breakfast was interrupted rather than never started. A coffee pot sits on the stove with ground still in it, the kind of detail that makes you picture someone getting up early, going through their morning routine, perhaps humming while they worked. A loaf of bread, now stale, is cut as though someone intended to prepare toast or sandwiches for the day ahead. In the crew's quarters, hammocks hang empty, but show the impressions of recent use. People scatter personal items as they would if they were living normally, not as if they were packing to leave permanently. A pipe lies on a small shelf, tobacco still in the bowl. Someone had been enjoying their evening smoke when something interrupted their routine. The ship's rigging tells its own story. The sails are set, but incorrectly, not in a way that would make the ship unmanageable, but in a way that suggests someone who knew what they were doing had adjusted them quickly, perhaps to make the ship stable while unmanned. It's the nautical equivalent of putting on your hazard lights before pulling over, a sign that whatever happened was planned, at least briefly. Below deck, the cargo area reveals the most intriguing evidence. 9 barrels of alcohol have leaked, their contents evaporating and creating a concentration of fumes that would make anyone nervous. The overwhelming smell resembled a paint store during a chemical spill. Any experienced captain would recognize the leak as a serious fire hazard, especially with the ship's lanterns and cooking fires. But here's what's particularly intriguing. The cargo hatches are open. In normal circumstances, you'd keep these closed to prevent water from getting in during storms. The fact that they're open suggests someone deliberately opened them, probably to ventilate the dangerous fumes. It's evidence of logical thinking under pressure, not panic. The captain's cabin provides the most personal insights. Charts are spread on the table, showing their planned route to Genoa. Navigational instruments are mostly in place, except for the chronometer, the ship's most essential tool for determining longitude. Its absence suggests whoever left took the one thing they'd absolutely need for navigation in a small boat. Sarah Briggs's belongings paint a picture of a woman who'd settled in for a long voyage but left suddenly. Her sewing basket sits open, thread still wound around her finger as if she'd looked up from her work and never looked back down. A letter to her mother-in-law lies half-finished on the small desk, stopping mid-sentence. The baby is well and growing more adventurous each day. Yesterday, she nearly... And that's where it ends. The pen lies beside the paper, ink dried on its tip. It's one of those details that makes the hair on your arm stand up, because it's so perfectly ordinary, right up until it becomes extraordinary. Little Sophia's presence is everywhere. A wooden cup rests on the floor of the main cabin. Toys are tucked into corners where little Sophia might have left them during play. A small blanket draped over the edge of a chair, as if someone had covered her for a nap and she kicked it off in her sleep. The ship's wheel is lashed in position, another sign of deliberate action rather than panic. Someone took the time to secure the helm before leaving, ensuring the ship would sail relatively straight rather than turning in circles. It's the kind of precaution you take when you're planning to come back. Perhaps most telling of all is that it's not disturbed. Valuables remain in place. The ship's modest supply of money is untouched. Personal items of obvious sentimental value, letters, photographs, small mementos, remain where their owners left them. The event wasn't a robbery, and it wasn't a hurried flight from danger. Standing in the main cabin as afternoon light streams through the portholes, you can almost feel the moment when normal life stopped. Someone was reading. The book lies open, pages slightly ruffled by the constant sea breeze coming through the cabin door. Someone was planning dinner. Vegetables sit in a basket, some beginning to wrinkle but still fresh enough to suggest recent purchase. Back in Gibraltar, where the Mary Celeste has been towed for investigation, you find yourself in the middle of what can only be described as Victorian-era bureaucratic chaos mixed with genuine maritime mystery. The British authorities, who have jurisdiction over the case, approach it with the kind of methodical thoroughness that made the empire run on time, but also occasionally missed the forest for the trees. Vice Admiralty Court Proctor Frederick Solly Flood takes charge of the investigation with the enthusiasm of someone who's been waiting his entire career for a genuinely intriguing case. Unfortunately, his enthusiasm is matched only by his suspicion that something sinister has occurred, which leads him to seek evidence of foul play in every water stain and piece of frayed rope. The first theory Flood pursues involves the crew of the Dei Gratia, the ship that found the Mary Celeste. His reasoning follows a certain Victorian logic. If you discover something suspicious, start by suspecting the people who found it. It's the maritime equivalent of assuming the person who reports a crime must be involved in it somehow. Captain Morehouse and his crew find themselves under intense scrutiny. Had they somehow arranged to meet the Mary Celeste at sea? Had they murdered its passengers and crew for the salvage money? The fact that Morehouse and Captain Briggs were acquaintances becomes, in Flood's mind, evidence of conspiracy rather than coincidence. The problem with this theory becomes apparent quickly. The salvage award for the Mary Celeste, while not insignificant, amounts to about 1/6 of the ship's value, hardly enough to justify multiple murders and an elaborate cover-up. Furthermore, the crew of the Dei Gratia would have had to be remarkably stupid criminals, since they voluntarily brought the suspicious vessel to port and submitted to investigation, rather than, say, sinking it quietly in the middle of the Atlantic. As the investigation continues, you watch expert after specialist examine the ship. Maritime surveyors crawl through every inch of the hull, seeking evidence of damage that might explain the abandonment. The experts determine that the ship is seaworthy, although it has clearly been sailing unmanned for some time. The rigging shows that wear is consistent with wind and weather, not sabotage. Dr. Patron, the island's physician, examines what appears to be blood on a sword found in the captain's cabin. This discovery sends Flood into paroxysms of excitement. Finally, evidence of violence. Unfortunately, further analysis suggests the stains are more likely rust mixed with some other substance, possibly fruit juice. The blood-stained sword becomes merely a rusty blade, and Dr. Patron's reputation for dramatic conclusions becomes a running joke among the other investigators. The cargo inspection reveals the leaked barrels and residual fumes, lending credence to the theory that alcohol vapors might have prompted the evacuation. Several investigators comment on the strong smell and the potential fire hazard it would represent to people living with open flames and oil lamps. One surveyor notes that similar cargo had caused fires on other vessels, making evacuation a reasonable precaution for any experienced captain. What emerges from weeks of testimony and investigation is a picture of the Mary Celeste as a perfectly ordinary merchant vessel that encountered some kind of situation requiring immediate but temporary evacuation. The evidence suggests careful preparation for departure, not panic or violence. The missing lifeboat, the opened cargo hatches for ventilation, the secured wheel, and the taken chronometer all point to intelligent decision-making under pressure. Flood, however, remains convinced that dark deeds have been done. His final report, while officially inconclusive, drips with suspicion about everyone involved. He seems particularly frustrated that no one has confessed to anything dramatic and that the evidence stubbornly refuses to support any of the more exciting theories about piracy, mutiny, or mass murder. The crew of the Dei Gratia finally receives their salvage award, though it's reduced from their original claim. They're clearly relieved to be done with the entire affair and to have their integrity intact, if slightly battered by weeks of suspicion and interrogation. As you read through the official reports, what strikes you most is how the investigation's focus on finding someone to blame obscured the more intriguing question of what actually happened. The bureaucratic need for criminal responsibility overshadowed the maritime mystery, turning what might have been a fascinating study in emergency seamanship into a frustrating search for villains who probably never existed. Standing on the dock in Gibraltar, watching the Mary Celeste rock gently in the harbour, you realize that sometimes the most interesting mysteries are the ones that resist easy answers. The Mary Celeste story didn't end with the Gibraltar investigation. If anything, that's where her second life as a legend really began. Like a celebrity who becomes more famous for being famous than for any particular talent, the ship found herself transformed from a working merchant vessel into maritime mythology. After the investigation, the ship was sold at auction and returned to service under new ownership. You might think this would be the end of her story, but ships that become famous for mysterious reasons tend to attract a particular kind of attention. Her new owners probably thought they were getting a bargain, a perfectly good brigantine with an interesting history. What they got instead was a vessel that seemed to carry her mystery like a persistent odor that wouldn't air out. Over the next 13 years, the Mary Celeste changed hands 17 times. This is roughly equivalent to a house being sold every 9 months, which suggests either terrible luck or a terrible reputation. Ships, like houses, can develop reputations that follow them from owner to owner, and the Mary Celeste's reputation was becoming distinctly problematic. Her various captains reported difficulties finding crews willing to sail on her. Sailors, who are professionally superstitious as a matter of survival, began to regard her as unlucky. Stories grew in the telling. What began as a mystery about missing people became tales of ghostly apparitions, mysterious voices in the rigging, and equipment that malfunctioned in inexplicable ways. The ship's final voyage came in 1885, when she was deliberately wrecked on a reef near Haiti in what appears to have been an insurance fraud attempt. Her last owner, G.C. Parker, had loaded her with worthless cargo but insured it for far more than its value. The plan was simple. Wreck Parker planned to sell the ship, claim the insurance, and profit from what had become an increasingly unprofitable vessel. Unfortunately for Parker, the insurance investigators were more competent than the Gibraltar officials had been. They quickly discovered the fraudulent cargo and Parker's scheme. He was prosecuted, though the case fell apart due to insufficient evidence. Apparently, proving insurance fraud was as tricky in the 1880s as it is today. The Mary Celeste's physical end on that Haitian reef was anticlimactic for a ship that had become synonymous with maritime mystery. She didn't disappear dramatically in the fog or sail off into the sunset. She simply ran aground in shallow water and broke apart in the waves, her timbers scattered by storms and salvaged by locals for more practical purposes. But her story was just beginning its strangest chapter. Writers discovered the Mary Celeste and found in her mystery the perfect foundation for fiction. Arthur Conan Doyle, before he became famous for Sherlock Holmes, wrote a short story called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement that took the basic facts of the Mary Celeste and embellished them with murders, racial conspiracy, and dramatic confrontations. Doyle's story was so compelling that many people began to confuse his fiction with the actual facts. Details from his imagination, like the breakfast still warm on the table or the ship's cat found alive and well, became part of the true story in popular retellings. It's a perfect example of how a positive story can become more powerful than mere facts. Hollywood eventually discovered the Mary Celeste, producing films that bore increasingly little resemblance to the historical mystery. In movie versions, the ship became haunted, cursed, or the scene of elaborate supernatural conspiracies. Each retelling added new dramatic elements while stripping away the subtle human mystery that made the original story so compelling. Standing on a modern dock, watching contemporary ships come and go, you realize that the Mary Celeste's greatest mystery isn't what happened to her passengers and crew. It's how a straightforward maritime incident became one of history's most enduring legends. The ship herself may be gone, scattered as driftwood on a Caribbean beach, but her story continues to sail on, picking up new passengers and new theories with every telling. As you stand here, having followed the Mary Celeste's transformation from a working ship to an eternal mystery, you are likely wondering what truly happened on that November morning in 1872. Like many intriguing questions in life, this one lacks a tidy, conclusive answer. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Captain Briggs faced some kind of emergency that convinced him to evacuate his ship temporarily. The evidence strongly suggests this wasn't a panicked flight. It was a calculated decision made by an experienced seaman who he believed he was taking a reasonable precaution. The open cargo hatches, the missing chronometer, and the orderly departure all point to someone who expected to return. The alcohol fume theory remains the most plausible explanation. Those 9 leaked barrels created a genuinely dangerous situation in the wooden confines of a 19th century ship. Experts in modern maritime studies generally concur that Briggs had the right to evacuate until the fumes dissipated. Perhaps the tragedy lay in the fact that he never had the opportunity to return. Perhaps a sudden squall separated the lifeboat from the ship. Perhaps the tow line broke in rough seas. Perhaps Briggs miscalculated the weather or the distance to land. Small boats in the Atlantic face enormous challenges, and the margin for error is slim. What seemed like a temporary precaution might have become a fatal miscalculation through no fault of anyone involved. Alternatively, the explanation could be something we have not yet considered. Maritime history is full of incidents where ships were abandoned for reasons that seemed perfectly logical at the time, but appear mysterious to later investigators. The ocean is a vast, unpredictable environment where the difference between routine and disaster can be measured in minutes. What makes the Mary Celeste story so enduringly fascinating isn't just the mystery itself, but what it reveals about our need to discover explanations for things that resist explanation. We've turned a probable emergency evacuation into a supernatural legend because the alternative, accepting that sometimes undesirable things happen to good people for mundane reasons, is somehow less satisfying than imagining elaborate conspiracies or paranormal interventions. The real people involved, Benjamin Briggs, Sarah, little Sophia, and the 7 crew members, have been overshadowed by their own mystery. Instead of being individuals who lived, worked, worried about their families, and faced a crisis that demanded immediate action, they have transformed into characters in a story. In our fascination with what happened to them, we sometimes forget that they were people much like ourselves, making the best decisions they could with the information they had. Perhaps that's the Mary Celeste's final lesson, that life rarely provides the clear-cut answers we crave, and that mystery isn't always sinister. Sometimes ships are abandoned for beneficial reasons that lead to tragic consequences. Sometimes people make reasonable decisions that have unreasonable outcomes. Occasionally, the most extraordinary mysteries have the most ordinary explanations. As you settle back into your comfortable spot, maybe finishing that cup of tea that's been growing cold while we wandered through this maritime puzzle, consider that the Mary Celeste's greatest gift might not be her mystery, but her reminder that the world is full of stories we'll never completely understand, and perhaps that's acceptable. Perhaps some questions are more valuable than their answers, and some mysteries are worth preserving not because they're supernatural, but because they're beautifully, frustratingly human. The Mary Celeste sails on in our imagination, her sails set for destinations we'll never know, carrying passengers we'll never meet again, bound for ports that exist only in the space between what we know and what we wonder. And sometimes, just before you fall asleep, you might find yourself wondering what little Sophia would have grown up to become, and whether Captain Briggs ever regretted that final decision to lower the lifeboat on what seemed like just another ordinary day at sea. Picture this: You're settling into your favorite reading chair on a September evening in 1983. The world outside feels perfectly ordinary. Somewhere, people are watching Cheers on television, kids are trading baseball cards, and your neighbor is probably still trying to figure out how to program that newfangled VCR. But 40 miles south of Moscow, in a bunker that looks like it was designed by someone who thought comfort was a dirty word, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is about to have the worst night shift of his life. You know those nights when everything that can go wrong does? Well, imagine that feeling, but instead of your coffee maker breaking and your car not starting, the stakes involve every living thing on the planet. Petrov is sitting in front of a console that looks like something from a science fiction movie. All blinking lights and serious looking buttons that you'd be terrified to accidentally lean against. The Oko early warning system stretches across the Soviet Union like an electronic spiderweb, its satellites perched in space with one job: watch for American missiles. It's 1983, and the Cold War isn't just cold, it's practically Arctic. President Reagan has been referring to the Soviet Union as an evil empire, a characterization as diplomatic as calling your mother-in-law's cooking interesting. Meanwhile, the Soviets are convinced the Americans are planning a first strike, possibly disguised as a military exercise. Petrov isn't your typical military officer. While his colleagues tend to see the world in stark black and white, he views it more like a complicated jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces might be from different boxes entirely. Tonight, he's the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, a facility so secret that it doesn't officially exist. You could drive past it and think it's just another unremarkable Soviet concrete building, which is precisely the point. The evening starts quietly enough. Petrov reviews reports, checks systems, and probably wishes he'd brought a thermos of something stronger than tea. The bunker hums with the white noise of electronics and ventilation systems, creating that particular kind of institutional quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. But here's where our story takes its first unsettling turn. At 12:15 a.m. on September the 26th, the early warning system decides to have what you might politely call a moment. Red lights begin flashing with the urgent persistence of a smoke detector with a dying battery, except the alarm isn't alerting you to burned toast. It's announcing that 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles are heading towards Soviet soil. In the Hollywood version of this story, there would be dramatic music, people shouting, and someone would definitely spill coffee on something important. But reality is quieter and somehow more terrifying. The computer screen displays the information with bureaucratic efficiency, indicating that incoming missiles have been detected, launch sites identified, impact time is calculated. Have a lovely day. Petrov stares at the screen, and you can imagine his thoughts racing like a hamster on an espresso bender. Protocol is crystal clear in situations like this. Report the attack immediately to Soviet command, who would then have perhaps 20 minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike. It's not a decision you want to make before you've had your morning coffee, except it's past midnight and morning feels very far away. The weight of the moment settles around him like a heavy blanket. This isn't a drill, and there's no do-over if he gets it wrong. Pick up that red phone and you've potentially started World War III. Don't pick it up, and you might have just let your country get destroyed without warning anyone. It's the kind of choice that makes deciding what to have for lunch seem refreshingly simple. Now, it's crucial to imagine yourself in Petrov's shoes, which likely weren't the most comfortable ones to begin with. You're looking at a computer screen that's essentially telling you that Armageddon has begun, and you have minutes, not hours, not days, but minutes, to decide what to do about it. It's like being asked to choose between chocolate and vanilla ice cream, except one flavor might accidentally end civilization. But Petrov has something that saves the world, a beautifully stubborn streak of skepticism. While the computer insists that 5 missiles are inbound, his mind starts picking apart the scenario like a detective examining a crime scene. 5 missiles? Really? If the Americans were actually launching a first strike, wouldn't they send everything they had? 5 missiles would be like trying to knock down a brick wall with a handful of pebbles. Technically possible, but probably not the strategy you choose if you really meant business. You see, Petrov understands something that the computer doesn't: context. The early warning system is brilliant at detecting heat signatures and trajectory calculations, but it's terrible at understanding human nature. It can tell you what appears to be happening, but it can't tell you whether it actually makes sense. The minutes tick by, like hours. Somewhere above, those satellites are faithfully reporting data, completely unaware that they might be triggering the end of the world over what could be a cosmic misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Petrov is doing something that computers can't. He's thinking about the bigger picture. He considers the geopolitical situation like someone examining a complicated recipe. The Americans, for all their bellicose rhetoric, haven't shown signs of preparing for an actual nuclear exchange. Their military exercises, while provocative, have followed predictable patterns. And if you were really planning to start a nuclear war, you probably wouldn't begin with just 5 missiles when you had thousands available. It would be like deciding to redecorate your living room by painting only one wall. But doubt is a tricky companion at moments like this. What if he's wrong? What if this really is the opening salvo of an American attack, and his skepticism is about to cost his country its only chance to respond? The weight of potentially millions of lives presses down on his shoulders like the world's most uncomfortable backpack. The fascinating thing about this moment is how ordinary it feels from Petrov's perspective. There's no dramatic music, no cinematic tension, just a man in a concrete bunker, looking at flashing lights, trying to decide whether the world is actually ending. It's a bureaucratic apocalypse, which somehow feels more frightening than the Hollywood version. Other officers in the facility are looking at him expectantly. They can see the same warnings he can, and they're waiting for him to follow protocol. The red telephone sits there like an invitation to disaster. One call, and the Soviet nuclear arsenal would begin its deadly countdown. The machinery of mutually assured destruction would grind into motion, and there would be no taking it back. But Petrov does something remarkable. He chooses to trust his instincts over his technology. In an age when we're constantly told that computers are smarter than humans, that data doesn't lie, and that machines are more reliable than intuition, he decides that sometimes human judgment trumps electronic certainty. He doesn't pick up the phone. Instead, he reports the incident as a system malfunction. The incident is classified as a false alarm based on his assessment of the situation, although it has not been proven or confirmed. It's the kind of decision that either makes you a hero or has you court-martialed, with very little middle ground between those two outcomes. The clock continues its relentless advance, and the missile impact time approaches. If Petrov is wrong, Soviet cities are about to be destroyed, and his refusal to report the attack will go down in history as one of the most catastrophic errors in human judgment. If he's right, well, nothing will happen, which is sometimes the most beautiful outcome imaginable. You know that feeling when you're waiting for important news, maybe test results from the doctor, or whether you got that job, or if your teenager made it home safely. That suspended animation, where time seems to move like honey in winter, that's where Petrov finds himself, except the stakes are slightly higher than usual. He's essentially betting the world that his gut feeling is more accurate than a multi-million-dollar early warning system. The beautiful irony of this situation is that if Petrov is right, nothing dramatic will happen. The missiles won't arrive, the world won't end, and most people will never know how close they came to a very bad day. Success in this case looks exactly like an ordinary night where nothing interesting happens. It's like being a smoke detector. You're only noticed when things go wrong. Meanwhile, the ecosystem continues its electronic insistence that doom is imminent. The satellites don't have the luxury of doubt. They're designed to report what they see, not to philosophize about it. From their perspective, 40,000 miles above Earth, they've detected heat signatures and trajectory patterns that match their programming for incoming ballistic missiles. They're doing their job perfectly, which is exactly the problem. But here's something wonderful about human nature. We're remarkably good at pattern recognition when we let ourselves think instead of just react. Petrov's brain is working like a master detective, examining not just the immediate evidence, but the broader context. Why would the Americans attack with such a small number of missiles? Why now? Why this particular configuration? It's like looking at a painting and noticing that while all the technical elements are correct, Something about the composition feels wrong. The brushstrokes are right, the colors are accurate, but the overall picture doesn't make sense. Petrov is seeing past the technical data to the human logic underneath, and that logic is telling him something important. This doesn't feel like how a real nuclear attack would begin. The minutes crawl by with the enthusiasm of a reluctant student heading to detention. If those missiles are real, they should be showing up on ground-based radar systems soon. But as the projected impact time approaches, something beautiful happens. Nothing. No secondary confirmations, no radar contacts, no mushroom clouds on the horizon. Just the same ordinary September night that was quietly minding its own business before the computers decided to panic. You can imagine the relief washing over Petrov like warm water after a cold shower. His instincts were right. The early warning system, for all its technological sophistication, had essentially cried wolf, or in this case, cried nuclear war, which is considerably more serious than a wolf but follows the same basic principle of false alarms causing unnecessary panic. But the story doesn't end there, because now comes the part that often gets overlooked in dramatic retellings, the aftermath. Petrov has to explain to his superiors why he chose not to report what the computer said was an incoming nuclear attack. This is like trying to explain to your boss why you decided not to evacuate the building when the fire alarm went off, except the building is an entire country and the fire alarm costs more than most people's houses. The investigation that follows is thorough and probably not particularly fun for Petrov. Military bureaucracies are not known for their appreciation of freelance thinking, especially when it comes to nuclear warfare protocols. You don't just ignore early warning systems because you have a hunch, at least not without filling out a considerable amount of paperwork afterward. But here's the thing about being right in a spectacular way. It tends to vindicate even the most unconventional decision-making. The technical analysis eventually confirms what Petrov's instincts told him that night. The satellites had misidentified sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds as the heat signatures of missile launches. It was a cosmic case of mistaken identity, like thinking your neighbor's garden hose is a snake. Now, you might expect that someone who single-handedly prevented World War III would become an instant celebrity, maybe get a parade, and certainly earn a spot in the history books. But you'd be forgetting something important about the Soviet Union in 1983. They weren't exactly in the business of advertising their technological failures, especially when those failures nearly triggered nuclear Armageddon. Instead of becoming a hero, Petrov finds himself in the peculiar position of being the man who saved the world and can't tell anyone about it. It's like performing the most important magic trick in history and then being sworn to secrecy about how it was done. The Soviet military, understandably embarrassed that their expensive early warning system had confused clouds with missiles, decided that the less said about the entire incident, the better. This is where the story takes on an almost surreal quality. Petrov goes back to his regular duties, probably gets his regular paychecks, and continues living his life while carrying the knowledge that he once held the fate of human civilization in his hands. It's the ultimate example of carrying your work stress home with you. The fascinating thing about this period is how normal everything feels. The world continues spinning, people go about their daily lives, and nobody knows how close they came to a very different kind of morning on September 26th. It's like learning that your morning commute regularly takes you past a dormant volcano. Technically, nothing has changed, but somehow everything feels different once you know. Petrov's colleagues at the facility are aware of what happened, of course, but they're bound by the same secrecy requirements. Imagine having the most interesting story in the world and not being allowed to tell it at parties. It would be like winning the lottery and having to pretend you're still worried about your electric bill. But secrets have a way of eventually surfacing, like corks in water. The story begins to leak out through various channels. Military historians, investigative journalists, and former Soviet officials who feel more talkative after the Cold War ends. Each telling adds new details, new perspectives, and new appreciation for just how close humanity came to accidentally destroying itself over a meteorological misunderstanding. What emerges from these accounts is a portrait of a man who was remarkably well suited for his impossible moment in history. Petrov wasn't a maverick or a rebel. He was simply someone who understood that sophisticated technology is only as good as the human judgment that interprets it. He had the rare combination of technical knowledge and common sense that allowed him to see past the flashing lights to the bigger picture. The more you learn about that night, the more you realize how many things had to go right for the story to end well. Petrov had to be the duty officer. Someone else might have followed protocol without question. The false alarm had to be ambiguous enough to allow for doubt. A more convincing fake attack might not have triggered his skepticism. And perhaps, most importantly, the geopolitical situation had to be stable enough that taking 20 minutes to think didn't cost everything. It's humbling to realize how much of human survival can depend on individual moments of good judgment. We like to think that our systems are foolproof, that our safeguards are redundant, and that catastrophe is prevented by institutional wisdom rather than individual insight. But sometimes it comes down to one person in a bunker, looking at flashing lights and deciding to trust their instincts over their instructions. The story of that September night is ultimately about the irreplaceable value of human judgment in an automated world. Computers can process information faster than humans. Satellites can detect heat signatures from thousands of miles away, and early warning systems can calculate missile trajectories with mathematical precision. But they can't do the one thing that saved the world that night. They can't step back, look at the bigger picture and say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. You know how sometimes the most important events are the ones that don't happen? Like when you almost get into a car accident but don't, or when you nearly say something you'd regret but catch yourself just in time. The night of September 26, 1983, is one of those non-events that changed everything precisely because it remained a non-event. The beautiful thing about disasters that don't occur is that life continues with blissful ignorance of what might have been. People wake up the next morning, complain about their coffee being too cold or too hot, and worry about perfectly normal things like mortgage payments and whether their kids are doing their homework. The world keeps spinning, completely unaware that it almost didn't. But in the shadowy world of nuclear strategy and Cold War politics, Petrov's decision sends ripples that spread far beyond that concrete bunker outside Moscow. The incident becomes a case study, though a classified one, in the limitations of automated systems and the continuing importance of human oversight. Military strategists on both sides of the Iron Curtain begin asking uncomfortable questions about their own early warning systems. What if this had happened to American computers? What if the false alarm had been more convincing? What if the duty officer had been someone less inclined to question the technology? These questions don't have comfortable answers, which is precisely why they need to be asked. The technical investigation into the false alarm demonstrates the ease with which a combination of circumstances can fool sophisticated systems. The combination of sunlight, clouds, satellite positioning, and computer algorithms resembled an incoming missile attack to electronic eyes. It was like a perfect storm, except instead of rain and wind, it was photons and software creating the potential for nuclear winter. This discovery leads to improvements in the ecosystem, better training for operators, and more robust procedures for verifying alerts. But it also highlights a fundamental truth about the nuclear age. No system is perfect, and the margin for error in nuclear warfare is essentially zero. You cannot partially launch a nuclear missile, start World War III in a limited way, or nearly destroy civilization. These are binary choices with permanent consequences. The incident also becomes a quiet catalyst for broader discussions about nuclear strategy. Not immediately, of course. In 1983, both superpowers are still deeply committed to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. However, the close call raises questions about the effectiveness of highly sensitive alert systems and automated reactions to possible dangers. Think about the psychological weight that Petrov carries after that night. He knows something that almost nobody else knows, how fragile the peace really is, how easily a software glitch or a meteorological anomaly can bring two superpowers to the brink of nuclear exchange. It's like being the only person who knows that the bridge everyone drives across every day is held up by a single bolt that's working loose. Years later, when the Cold War begins to thaw and people start talking more openly about close calls and near misses, Petrov's story takes on almost mythical qualities. Here was a moment when the entire trajectory of human history pivoted on one person's decision to think rather than react, to question rather than comply, and to trust human judgment over mechanical certainty. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Petrov is how he handles the knowledge of what he did. There's no swagger, no sense of self-importance, and no demand for recognition. He simply did his job as he understood it, made the best decision he could with the information available, and then got on with his life. It's the kind of quiet heroism that doesn't make for dramatic movies, but represents the best of human nature. The story also serves as a reminder that the Cold War, for all its grand strategies and elaborate theories, ultimately came down to individual human beings making decisions under pressure. All the sophisticated technology, all the careful planning, and all the military doctrine in the world couldn't eliminate the need for someone to look at a situation and decide what it actually meant. The peculiar thing about preventing the end of the world is that it doesn't feel like much of an accomplishment at the time. There's no medal ceremony for disasters that don't happen, no parade for catastrophes avoided, and no Nobel Prize for best use of common sense in a nuclear crisis. Petrov goes back to his regular life, carrying the weight of what he knows but unable to share it with anyone who wasn't there. This phase is where the story becomes almost absurdly normal. The man who saved civilization goes home to his apartment, probably watches television, and maybe argues with his neighbors about parking spaces. He continues his military service, deals with the bureaucracy of the Soviet system, and lives the kind of ordinary life that's only possible because extraordinary disaster was averted. However, secrets, particularly significant ones, have a tendency to demand disclosure. As the years pass and the Cold War machinery begins to creak and eventually collapse, the story of that September night starts to emerge from the classified shadows. Military historians piece together accounts, former Soviet officials become more talkative, and gradually the world learns about the night it almost ended. When Petrov's story finally becomes public, the reaction is fascinating. People struggle to comprehend how close humanity came to accidental self-destruction. It's like learning that you've been walking across a tightrope without realizing it. Technically, nothing has changed, but your perspective on everything is suddenly different. The story serves as a compelling argument for nuclear disarmament, but not in the way you might anticipate. It's not the horror of nuclear weapons that moves people, but the absurdity of the situation. The idea that a computer glitch and some oddly positioned clouds could have triggered World War III makes the entire nuclear standoff seem less like strategic deterrence and more like an elaborate game of Russian roulette with the entire planet. Petrov himself becomes something of a reluctant celebrity in his later years. He conducts interviews, accepts awards, and speaks at conferences about nuclear policy. But he always maintains a kind of bemused detachment from his role as the man who saved the world. To him, he was simply doing his job, making the best decision he could with the information available. The fact that this decision happened to prevent global catastrophe was, in his view, almost incidental. This perspective is both refreshing and slightly unsettling. We want our heroes to be heroic, to understand the magnitude of their actions, and to carry themselves with the weight of their accomplishments. But Petrov's ordinariness is precisely what made him effective that night. He wasn't trying to be a hero, he was trying to be right. The story also raises uncomfortable questions about how many other close calls there might have been, and how many other Petrovs have made similar decisions without the world ever learning about them. The nuclear age is full of incidents that were classified, buried, or simply never reported. Each represents a moment when human judgment stood between ordinary life and extraordinary catastrophe. Perhaps most importantly, Petrov's story serves as a reminder that the most crucial decisions are often made not by presidents or generals, but by individuals in the right place at the right time with the courage to trust their instincts. History is shaped not just by grand strategies and sweeping movements, but with quiet moments when someone looks at a flashing computer screen and decides to think before acting. The man who prevented nuclear war by refusing to panic becomes, in his quiet way, a symbol of everything that's best about human nature under pressure. This is not the dramatic heroism of action movies, but the thoughtful heroism of taking a breath, considering the options, and choosing wisdom over protocol when the two conflict. And so we come to the end of our story, though of course it's not really an ending. It's more like the moment when you realize that what seemed like thrilling mystery was actually a meditation on the nature of courage, judgment, and the strange ways that history unfolds. Stanislav Petrov lived until 2017, long enough to see the Cold War become a historical curiosity, to watch his story become known around the world, and to receive recognition for his role in preserving human civilization. But by most accounts, he remained remarkably unchanged by his brush with global significance. He was, to the end, simply a man who had done his job well at a crucial moment. The lesson of that September night isn't really about nuclear weapons or Cold War politics, though those are certainly part of the story. It's about the irreplaceable value of human judgment in an increasingly automated world. It's about the importance of maintaining the ability to step back from the immediate crisis and ask the larger question: does this situation make sense? In our current age of artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making, Petrov's story feels particularly relevant. We're constantly being told that computers are smarter than humans, that data doesn't lie, and that machine learning can solve problems better than human intuition. And in many cases, this is true. But on that night in 1983, human intuition saved the world precisely because it could do something that computers couldn't. It could doubt. The most important decision in human history was made by someone trying to be careful, not someone trying to be important. Petrov's goal was not to become a hero, but to prevent a mistake. From his perspective, avoiding this particular mistake was almost beside the point, even though it saved every living thing on Earth. This fact is perhaps the most comforting aspect of the entire story. The world wasn't saved by superhuman wisdom or extraordinary courage, but by ordinary human judgment applied thoughtfully under pressure. It suggests that most of us, faced with similar circumstances, might be capable of comparable clarity. The heroism wasn't in being special, but in being sensible. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you might gain comfort in knowing that somewhere out there, in control rooms and command centers around the world, there are people like Petrov, individuals who understand that the most sophisticated technology is only as beneficial as the human wisdom that guides it. These individuals understand that sometimes the most important action is to take a breath, look at the bigger picture, and trust your instincts. The night the world almost ended turned out to be just another night, which is precisely how it should be. The missiles that weren't there didn't arrive. The war that wasn't starting didn't begin, and humanity continued its long, complicated, often absurd journey through history, all because one person in a bunker outside Moscow decided to think before acting, to question before reacting, and to trust human judgment over electronic certainty. And perhaps that's the most beautiful mystery of all, how often the most extraordinary outcomes arise from the most ordinary virtues. The world was saved not by heroes, but by someone doing his job carefully. The world was saved not by dramatic action, but by thoughtful inaction. It was not someone who sought to alter the course of history, but rather someone who merely aimed to achieve accuracy. Sleep well, knowing that sometimes the most decisive victories are the ones that look like nothing happened at all. Occasionally, the greatest courage is simply the wisdom to pause, think, and choose understanding over urgency. And sometimes saving the world is as simple as trusting that 5 missiles don't make sense when you could send 500. The night the world almost ended was, in the end, just another night. How the best ending should be. So quiet and ordinary that you almost don't notice them happening.
Brother Matthias pressed his quill against the parchment, ink pooling like a small wound. The monastery scriptorium felt unusually quiet this July morning, in 1518, as if the very walls held their breath. Outside Strasbourg's timber-framed houses, something unprecedented was unfolding, something that would challenge every assumption about human nature, divine will, and the boundaries between reason and chaos. The woman had begun 3 days prior. Frau Trophea, a baker's wife, whose hands had kneaded thousands of loaves and whose feet had walked the cobblestones in measured steps for 43 years. Yet, on that sweltering Tuesday, those same feet had betrayed every principle of human dignity. They moved without her permission, lifting and stepping, turning and pivoting in patterns that belonged neither to any known dance nor to any recognizable madness. Matthias had witnessed possession before. The monastery served as refuge for those touched by devils, those whose minds had fractured under the weight of worldly concerns. But the dancing differed fundamentally from the thrashing, incoherent movements of the afflicted. Frau Trophea's dance possessed an almost mathematical precision, as if her body followed instructions written in a language only her muscles could read. The crowd that gathered around her grew throughout that first day. Initially, neighbours assumed she celebrated some private joy, perhaps news of a pregnancy after years of barrenness, or word that her husband's debts had been forgiven. But as hours passed without pause, without water or rest, their smiles transformed into frowns of concern, then masks of fear. Dr. Hieronymus Bock, the city's most respected physician, arrived before sunset. His examination revealed no fever, no signs of ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, and no symptoms of St. Vitus's dance. Her pulse remained steady despite the continuous exertion. Although her eyes appeared wild, they tracked movement and responded to sound. Most puzzling of all, when spoken to directly, she could respond coherently, even as her body continued its relentless choreography. "I cannot stop," she gasped between movements that resembled a peasant reel crossed with something far more ancient. "My feet, they know something I do not." By the second day, 3 others had joined her. Hans Burkhardt, a blacksmith, was among them, his powerful frame making his graceful pirouettes seem almost blasphemous. Elisabeth Zimmern, who was barely 16, performed a dance that resembled a courtly pavane. Most disturbing of all was Father Wilhelm, whose ecclesiastical robes billowed as he spun in movements that seemed to mock the very rituals he had performed for 20 years. The city council convened emergency sessions. The medical college debated theories ranging from corrupted humours to celestial malignment. The clergy declared days of prayer and fasting, yet nothing slowed the spreading contagion, which it certainly was. Although it differed from any plague that had ever afflicted Christian lands, Brother Matthias found himself appointed as official recorder, tasked with documenting each new case, each development in what scholars were already calling the most significant mass affliction since the Children's Crusade. His training in both theology and natural philosophy positioned him uniquely to observe without predetermined judgment, and to record without the filter of established doctrine. What he witnessed defied every category of human experience. The dancers, for lack of a better term, showed no signs of coordination, yet moved in patterns that occasionally synchronized. They ate when food was placed in their mouths, but seemed incapable of stopping to seek nourishment independently. Most unsettling, they appeared to find genuine joy in their condition, laughing and singing between bouts of exhaustion that would have felled any normal person. As his quill scratched across the parchment that would become one of history's most important primary sources, Matthias couldn't shake the feeling that he documented not merely an outbreak of collective madness, but something far more profound. The dancers moved as if responding to music only they could hear, as if their bodies had become instruments in some cosmic composition whose meaning remained tantalizingly beyond comprehension. The mystery had only begun to unfold. Within a week, the dancing had claimed 34 souls. Brother Matthias walked the streets each dawn, counting the swaying figures, noting the peculiar evolution of their movements. What had begun as individual expressions of inexplicable compulsion was developing into something resembling choreographed chaos. The city's response revealed the deep fractures in medieval understanding of human nature. Physicians clung to Galenic theories of humoral imbalance, prescribing bloodletting and purges that proved utterly ineffective. The clergy proclaimed the dancing a divine punishment for the city's moral failings, pointing to everything from excessive merchant profits to the popularity of secular music. Yet neither medical intervention nor spiritual remedies showed any impact on the spreading affliction. Most intriguing to Matthias was the pattern of contagion. The dance didn't spread through physical contact or proximity, as plagues typically did. Instead, it seemed to select its victims according to some hidden logic. Agnes Müller, a wealthy merchant's wife known for her charity work, began dancing while distributing bread to the poor, but her servants, who had closer contact with the afflicted, remained unaffected. Meanwhile, Klaus Weber, a solitary cobbler who rarely ventured from his workshop, suddenly appeared in the main square, his leather apron flying as he performed leaps that would have impressed the finest court entertainers. The dancers themselves provided few clues. During their brief moments of rest, never more than an hour and often far less, they spoke of dreams filled with music, of voices calling them to move, of an overwhelming sense that their dancing served some essential purpose they couldn't articulate. Frau Trophea, now entering her second week of continuous movement, claimed she could see patterns in the air itself, geometric shapes that guided her steps. It's not madness, she insisted to Dr. Bock during one of his increasingly frequent examinations. It's remembering. My body remembers something my mind forgot. The physician noted this comment in his records, along with his observation that the dancers showed remarkable physical resilience. Despite consuming minimal food and water, despite dancing through the heat of July days and the cool of summer nights, none showed signs of the exhaustion that should have killed them days ago. Their feet, which should have been bloodied stumps, remained intact. Their hearts, which should have burst from the exertion, beat with steady rhythm. Local authorities faced an impossible situation. The dancing disrupted commerce, frightened visitors, and challenged the social order. Yet the dancers committed no crime beyond the violation of public decorum. They harmed no one, stole nothing, preached no heresy. How do you arrest someone whose only offence is an inability to stand still? The guild masters demanded action. The bakers complained that the dancing crowds frightened customers. The weavers reported decreased productivity as workers abandoned their looms to watch the spectacle. The church worried about declining attendance at services, though ironically many citizens spent more time in prayer, begging God to spare them from joining the dance. Young Elisabeth Zimmer's case particularly troubled Matthias. The girl came from a respectable family, had shown no signs of mental instability, and had been betrothed to a goldsmith's son just weeks before her affliction began. Yet when her parents and fiancé pleaded with her to stop, she could only weep while her body continued its measured movements. "I want to stop," she sobbed, "but the music, can't you hear it? It's so beautiful, and it says I must dance until something happens. Something important." The goldsmith's son, Johann, maintained a vigil beside her, bringing water and food, wiping her tears, even attempting to hold her still through sheer physical force. Nothing worked. Eventually he began moving to her rhythm, swaying slightly as he sat beside her. Matthias watched this development with growing alarm, wondering if Johann might become the next victim. Dr. Bock proposed an experiment. If the dancing represented some form of musical enchantment, perhaps counter music might provide relief. He hired the city's best musicians to play calming melodies near the dancers, hoping to break whatever spell held them. The result was catastrophic. The moment the first note sounded, every dancer stopped. For 30 heartbeats, silence filled the square. Then, as if responding to some unheard conductor's baton, they began dancing with renewed vigour, their movements now synchronized to the musicians' playing. The music seemed to feed the affliction rather than cure it. That night, 3 musicians joined the dancers. Dr. Hieronymus Bock had studied at the finest universities in Europe. He had treated plague victims in Vienna, examined cases of ergotism in Bavaria, and corresponded with physicians from Paris to Prague. Yet the dancing plague challenged every principle of medical knowledge he had accumulated over 30 years of practice. His detailed observations, preserved in the monastery archives, provide the most systematic analysis of the phenomenon. The dancers showed no fever, no delirium, and no physical abnormalities beyond their compulsive movement. Their pulse rates, while elevated during active dancing, remained within survivable ranges. Most puzzling is that their bodies adapted to the continuous exertion in ways that defied physiological understanding. The human form is not designed for such prolonged activity, he wrote to his former professor at the University of Basel. Yet these individuals show no signs of the muscle deterioration, dehydration, or cardiac distress that should accompany such exertion. It is as if their bodies have entered some altered state that suspends normal biological limitations. Bock's attempts at treatment revealed the inadequacy of contemporary medical theory. Bloodletting, the universal remedy for humoral imbalance, produced no change in the dancer's condition. Purges and emetics failed to expel whatever poison might have caused the affliction. Even trepanation, performed on one willing volunteer, merely added a head wound to his list of ailments without diminishing his need to dance. The physician began to suspect that the dancing plague represented something entirely outside the realm of traditional medicine. His correspondence with Brother Matthias reveals a growing fascination with the metaphysical implications of the outbreak. What if this condition originates not in the body but in some faculty of the soul we do not yet understand, he speculated. The dancers speak consistently of hearing music, of seeing patterns, of following instructions that come from within rather than without. Perhaps we witness not disease but revelation. This theory gained support from an unexpected source. Rabbi Mordecai ben Avraham, Strasbourg's most learned Jewish scholar, approached Bock with references from ancient texts describing similar phenomena. The Talmud mentioned cases of compulsive dancing associated with divine visions. Kabbalistic texts described states of spiritual ecstasy that manifested through involuntary movement. Islamic scholars in nearby territories reported historical accounts of Sufi mystics whose dancing induced transcendent experiences. Perhaps, the rabbi suggested, these people have stumbled into a state of consciousness that mystics spend lifetimes trying to achieve. Bock found this perspective intriguing but problematic. The dancers showed none of the traditional signs of mystical experience. They reported no visions of divine beings, no prophecies, no unusual wisdom or insight. Instead, they seemed trapped in a state that brought neither spiritual enlightenment nor physical relief. The physician's most significant breakthrough came through careful observation of the dancers' interactions with each other. Despite the apparent randomness of their movements, patterns emerged. Dancers who had been strangers before their affliction began to move in complementary rhythms. Their individual dances gradually synchronized, creating complex group choreographies that seemed to serve some unifying purpose. Margaret Lohner, a widow who had joined the dancers in the third week, provided crucial testimony during one of her brief rest periods. "We are pieces of something larger," she gasped. "Each dance is a part, but we cannot see the whole. Only when we all move together does the true pattern emerge." Bock began mapping the dancers' positions and movements, creating diagrams that revealed an underlying geometry to their apparently chaotic activity. The patterns resembled mathematical principles he had encountered in architectural texts. Golden ratios, spiral sequences, harmonic proportions that appeared throughout nature. This discovery led to a disturbing realization. If the dancing followed mathematical laws, it might not be random affliction, but rather the manifestation of some deeper order. The dancers might be unconsciously creating a physical representation of abstract principles, their bodies serving as instruments in a vast calculation whose purpose remained hidden. The implications terrified both physician and scholar. If human beings could be compelled to serve as components in some larger system without their conscious awareness, what did this suggest about free will, about the nature of individual identity, about humanity's place in the cosmic order? As July drew to a close with over 60 dancers now active in Strasbourg's streets, Bock abandoned his attempts at medical treatment. Instead, he focused on documentation, convinced that he witnessed not disease but discovery, the unveiling of some fundamental aspect of human nature that had remained hidden until this extraordinary moment. The mystery was deepening rather than resolving, and the implications grew more unsettling with each passing day. The ecclesiastical response to the dancing plague exposed deep theological tensions within the church. Brother Matthias found himself at the centre of heated debates between different factions of clergy. each proposing radically different interpretations of the unprecedented phenomenon. Bishop Johann Weidmann initially declared the dancing a manifestation of demonic possession, ordering exorcisms and public prayers for the afflicted. Yet, when Father Wilhelm, one of the diocese's most respected priests, joined the dancers, this explanation became untenable. How could a man who had spent decades fighting evil suddenly succumb to it? The dancing father continued to recite prayers and bless those who approached him, even as his body swayed in patterns that seemed to mock ecclesiastical dignity. Prior Benedict, head of Matthias's monastery, proposed an alternative theory rooted in mystical tradition. Perhaps God tests our understanding, he suggested during a chapter meeting. Scripture tells us David danced before the Lord with all his might. The prophets often receive divine communication through ecstatic states. What if these dancers have been chosen to receive revelation in a form we do not yet comprehend? An unexpected source of support for this perspective emerged. Sister Johanna of the nearby convent of St. Agnes reported that several nuns had experienced powerful spiritual visions while observing the dancers. During their regular hours of prayer, they found themselves moving in subtle rhythms that seemed to echo the dancers' movements. Most significantly, they reported an enhanced sense of divine presence during these experiences. When I allow my body to respond to the rhythm I perceive in their dancing, Sister Johanna testified, my prayers become more profound, my connection to the Creator more immediate. It is as if their movements create a bridge between earthly and heavenly realms. Yet this mystical interpretation faced strong opposition from the Dominican friars, who saw in the dancing a dangerous form of enthusiasm that threatened church authority. Brother Heinrich, their most vocal spokesman, argued that any spiritual experience not mediated through established religious channels must be viewed with extreme suspicion. These dancers claimed to receive instruction directly from some divine or cosmic source, he declared during a public sermon. They circumvent the sacraments, disregard clerical guidance, and adhere to impulses that might stem from the depths of hell. If we accept their claims, we undermine the very foundation of Christian order. The theological debate intensified when several dancers began incorporating religious gestures into their movements. They crossed themselves while spinning, genuflected during leaps, and raised their arms in positions reminiscent of crucifixion. Yet these sacred elements appeared seamlessly woven into dance patterns that retained their essentially secular character. Matthias observed these developments with growing fascination. The dancers seemed to access some form of religious expression that transcended traditional categories. Their movement prayers appeared simultaneously more primitive and more sophisticated than conventional worship, as if they had discovered a method of spiritual communication that predated organized religion yet pointed towards some more evolved form of divine encounter. The situation became even more complex when Rabbi Mordecai reported similar theological discussions within the Jewish community. Several respected Torah scholars had begun incorporating swaying movements into their study sessions, claiming that physical rhythm enhanced their ability to penetrate sacred texts. The Kabbalistic tradition of meditative movement suddenly seemed directly relevant to current events. Perhaps, the rabbi suggested to Matthias during one of their regular conversations, we witness the emergence of a universal spiritual language that transcends the boundaries between our different faiths. The dancers may be unconsciously recovering ancient forms of worship that were practiced before religious traditions became institutionalized. This possibility alarmed both Christian and Jewish authorities. If the dancing represented some primordial form of spiritual expression, it potentially challenged the legitimacy of all established religious institutions. The dancers' apparent ability to access transcendent experiences without priestly mediation suggested that formal religious structures might be unnecessary, or even obstacles to genuine spiritual encounter. The controversy reached a crescendo when young Elisabeth Zimmern began speaking in what appeared to be unknown languages during her dance. Linguistic scholars determined that her utterances followed consistent grammatical patterns that corresponded to no known human tongue. Church authorities faced the uncomfortable possibility that she spoke in the tongues of angels mentioned in Scripture, yet outside any recognized ecclesiastical context. Bishop Weidmann found himself in an impossible position. He could not condemn phenomena that might represent genuine divine communication, yet he could not endorse activities that undermined church authority. His compromise solution satisfied no one. He declared the dancing neither inherently sacred nor profane, but rather a mysterious manifestation that required careful study before any definitive theological judgment could be made. This official position of studied neutrality reflected the broader uncertainty that gripped all of Strasbourg's intellectual and spiritual leaders. The dancing plague had revealed the inadequacy of every existing framework for understanding human behaviour and divine interaction. As July turned to August, with the number of dancers approaching 100, it became clear that the phenomenon would not be easily contained within familiar categories of explanation. The sacred and profane were merging in ways that challenged the very foundations of medieval worldview, and no one could predict where this unprecedented fusion might lead. The Strasbourg City Council faced an administrative nightmare without precedent in municipal law. How do you govern a population increasingly composed of individuals who cannot control their own movements? By early August 1518, nearly 100 citizens danced continuously through the streets, creating chaos that threatened the city's economic and social stability. Magistrate Conrad Wickram, elected to office based on his reputation for practical problem-solving, found every conventional solution ineffective. His first approach had been straightforward law enforcement: arrest the dancers for disturbing the peace. However, the city jail could not accommodate 100 prisoners, especially prisoners who required constant supervision and continued to dance within their cells. Moreover, the legal precedent was unclear. Medieval law addressed theft, assault, heresy, and various forms of misconduct, but nowhere in legal tradition could the magistrates find guidance for dealing with compulsive dancing. The guild masters presented increasingly desperate petitions. The bakers reported significant losses as crowds of spectators made normal business impossible. The cloth merchants complained that trade delegations from other cities were avoiding Strasbourg, fearing contamination by whatever affliction caused the dancing. Most seriously, agricultural workers from surrounding villages were abandoning their harvest duties, drawn to the city by reports of the miraculous dancing. If this continues through harvest season, warned Johann Zeckler, master of the Farmers' Guild, we face not merely economic disruption but potential famine. The dancers consume resources while producing nothing. Worse, they inspire others to abandon productive labour in favour of gawking at this spectacle. Wickram's attempts at practical solutions revealed the phenomenon's resistance to conventional intervention. He hired additional musicians, reasoning that if dancing was inevitable, perhaps organised music might channel it in less disruptive directions. This backfired spectacularly when the musicians themselves became infected and joined the ranks of the uncontrollably dancing. The magistrate then attempted to confine the dancers to a specific area outside the city walls, hoping to minimise their impact on daily commerce. However, the dancers showed no awareness of artificial boundaries. They moved according to internal imperatives that paid no attention to human attempts at crowd control. Guards assigned to maintain containment found themselves gradually swaying to the rhythm of the dancers' movements, requiring frequent rotation to prevent further infections. Legal scholars consulted ancient Roman law, canon law, and traditional Germanic customs, finding no precedent for the current situation. The dancers committed no crime, yet violated social order. They harmed no one, yet endangered public welfare. They followed no leader, yet moved with apparent coordination. Every category of legal classification proved inadequate. Dr. Bock's medical reports complicated attempts at legal resolution. His documentation demonstrated that the dancers suffered from no disease that legal authorities could reasonably quarantine. They showed no signs of madness that would justify confinement to asylums. Most problematically, they retained enough mental capacity to make their own decisions about most matters. They simply could not control their compulsive movement. The situation deteriorated when several city council members began showing signs of rhythmic susceptibility. Observers noticed Councilman Peter Imlin swaying during official meetings, his foot tapping in patterns that appeared to mimic the dancers' rhythms. Rather than acknowledge this development, the council implemented new procedures requiring all members to remain seated, and still during deliberations, with guards instructed to intervene if anyone showed signs of unusual movement. Economic pressure mounted as trade relationships suffered. Merchants from Basel and Frankfurt reported to their city councils that Strasbourg had become a city possessed, discouraging commercial interaction until the crisis resolved. The annual harvest fair, crucial to the region's economy, faced potential cancellation as participating merchants expressed reluctance to enter a city where they might become infected with uncontrollable dancing. Wickram's most creative solution involved attempting to negotiate directly with the dancers. Perhaps reasoning could succeed where force had failed. He organised formal meetings where city representatives attempted to discuss the situation with dancers during their brief rest periods. These conversations proved profoundly unsettling. The dancers consistently expressed their desire to stop, their awareness of the disruption they caused, and their complete inability to control their condition. Yet they also described their dancing as serving some essential purpose that they could not fully articulate. They spoke of participating in something larger than themselves, of their movements contributing to some vast pattern whose completion remained necessary. "Stop," you say, "but we can't stop any more than you can stop your heart," said Frau Trofea. "This dancing is not our choice. It is our function. When the pattern is complete, we will rest. Until then, we must continue." When pressed to explain what pattern they meant, the dancers could offer only vague descriptions of geometric shapes, musical harmonies, and mathematical relationships that their bodies somehow expressed through movement. Their testimony suggested they served as unwilling participants in some cosmic calculation whose nature remained beyond human comprehension. The Council's final attempt at resolution involved consulting authorities from other cities that had experienced similar phenomena. Historical research uncovered scattered reports of dancing outbreaks across European history, yet no detailed documentation was available to offer valuable guidance. Moreover, previous episodes had apparently resolved spontaneously, offering little insight into effective intervention strategies. By late August, Magistrate Wickram privately admitted defeat. The city government could neither stop the dancing nor effectively manage its consequences. They could only hope the phenomenon would end as mysteriously as it began, leaving them to deal with the aftermath. The authorities' inability to address the crisis reflected a deeper failure of medieval institutions to comprehend emerging realities that transcended traditional categories of understanding. September brought an unexpected development that changed everything Brother Matthias thought he understood about the dancing plague. The revelation came not through scholarly analysis or medical examination, but through the observations of an unlikely witness, Master Johann Gutenberg, a visiting printer investigating Strasbourg's potential as a location for his revolutionary, movable type workshop. Gutenberg possessed a unique perspective, shaped by his work with mechanical systems, mathematical precision, and pattern recognition essential to printing technology. While other observers focused on individual dancers or small groups, he studied the overall configuration of all dancers throughout the city. His trained eye, accustomed to detecting subtle alignments and spacing relationships, perceived something that had eluded everyone else. "They are not dancing randomly," he told Matthias during an evening meeting at the monastery. "From an elevated position, I observed from the cathedral tower, their movements create a vast geometric pattern that spans the entire city. Individual dancers serve as moving points in a complex diagram that appears to be nearing completion." Matthias initially dismissed this theory as fanciful speculation. However, Gutenberg's systematic documentation proved compelling. He had mapped the positions of all known dancers at regular intervals, creating a series of diagrams that revealed an underlying order to their apparently chaotic activity. The patterns resembled nothing in conventional human experience. They incorporated elements of sacred geometry, musical harmony, and mathematical principles that seemed almost too sophisticated for the medieval understanding. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The dancers were unconsciously creating a physical representation of abstract concepts that challenged the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. "Look at these measurements," Gutenberg explained, spreading his carefully drafted diagrams across the monastery table. The distances between dancers, the timing of their movements, the directions of their travel, everything follows precise mathematical relationships. They are drawing something in space and time, using their bodies as instruments in a calculation beyond human design. This discovery raised terrifying questions. If the dancers unconsciously followed mathematical laws, who or what had programmed these laws? The patterns were too complex, too purposeful to be accidental, yet they were also too alien to be products of human intelligence. The dancers themselves remained unaware of the larger design they were creating, responding to impulses they could not explain or control. Brother Matthias pondered the implications during sleepless nights. Were the dancers unwilling participants in some cosmic experiment? Had some intelligence, divine, demonic, or entirely other, selected Strasbourg as the site for a demonstration whose purpose remained hidden? The possibility that human beings could be manipulated like pieces on a chessboard challenged fundamental beliefs about free will and human dignity. Dr. Bock's medical observations supported Gutenberg's geometric analysis. The physician had noted that individual dancers' movements became increasingly precise over time, as if they were gradually learning to perform their roles more accurately. Their apparent fatigue seemed to diminish rather than increase, suggesting that their bodies were adapting to serve the requirements of the larger pattern. They are becoming more efficient, Bock reported. Their movements consume less energy while achieving greater precision. It is as if some process is optimizing their performance to serve functions we do not yet understand. The most unsettling aspect of Gutenberg's discovery was its progressive nature. The pattern was not static, but evolving, approaching some form of completion that might trigger unknown consequences. Based on the rate of change he had documented, the printer estimated that the geometric design would reach its final configuration within days. What happens when the pattern is complete? Matthias asked, though he feared the answer. Gutenberg could only speculate. Perhaps the dancers would finally be released from their compulsion. Perhaps the completion would trigger some larger event that the dancing had been designed to facilitate. Or perhaps the entire phenomenon would simply end, leaving behind only the memory of humanity's brief role as unwilling participants in some incomprehensible cosmic process. The printer's analysis also revealed why certain individuals were selected to become dancers, while others remained unaffected. The pattern required specific positions to be filled by dancers with particular physical characteristics, movement capabilities, and spatial relationships to other participants. The selection process had nothing to do with spiritual worthiness, moral character, or personal vulnerability. It was purely functional, based on requirements that remained hidden from human understanding. This mechanical view of the dancing plague stripped away all romantic or mystical interpretations. The dancers were not blessed visionaries or cursed victims. They were simply tools being used by some intelligence to create something beyond human comprehension. Their suffering, their loss of autonomy, their disruption of normal life served as acceptable costs in pursuing some larger objective. As September progressed, Gutenberg's predictions proved accurate. The dancers' movements became increasingly synchronized, their individual variations gradually harmonizing into a unified whole. The geometric pattern approached completion with mathematical inevitability, regardless of human attempts to understand or intervene. The residents of Strasbourg could only wait and wonder what would happen when the mysterious calculation finally reached its conclusion. The pattern that had claimed so many of their neighbours was nearly complete, and none could predict whether its fulfilment would bring liberation or catastrophe. October 15th, 1518. Brother Matthias recorded the date with a trembling hand, knowing he documented either the end of the most mysterious chapter in Strasbourg's history, or merely its transformation into something even more incomprehensible. The dancing plague, which had held the city captive for over 3 months, reached its conclusion in a manner that satisfied no theory and answered no questions. The end came with mathematical precision that confirmed Gutenberg's geometric analysis, while revealing its ultimate inadequacy. At exactly noon, when the cathedral bells announced the 6th hour, every dancer throughout the city stopped simultaneously. The dancers stopped not gradually, not individually, but in perfect unison, as if some cosmic conductor had finally lowered his baton. The silence that followed was more disturbing than the months of continuous movement had been. 137 people stood motionless in streets, squares and courtyards throughout Strasbourg, their faces bearing expressions of profound confusion and loss. They looked around like dreamers awakening in unfamiliar surroundings, unable to reconcile their present situation with their last clear memories. Dr. Bock rushed to examine the former dancers, expecting to find signs of exhaustion, malnutrition or physical damage from their prolonged ordeal. Instead, he discovered individuals in remarkably good health. Better health, in many cases, than they had enjoyed before their dancing began. Chronic ailments had disappeared, old injuries had healed, even elderly dancers showed renewed vitality that seemed to reverse months or years of aging. It is as if the dancing purified their bodies while enslaving their wills, Bock reported to the emergency council session convened that afternoon. They have been transformed by their experience in ways that challenge every principle of natural philosophy. Yet the physical improvements came with a price that became apparent only gradually. The former dancers retained no detailed memories of their time in the grip of the compulsion. They remembered beginning to dance, and they remembered the moment of release, but the months between remained largely blank, as if their consciousness had been suspended, while their bodies served purposes beyond their understanding. Worrisomely, they reported enduring sensations, implying that their experience had not fully concluded. They felt perpetual awareness of subtle rhythms, faint melodies that seemed to emanate from the air itself. Some claimed they could still perceive the geometric patterns that had guided their movements, now visible as translucent overlays on the normal world. "The dancing has ended," Frau Troffea told Matthias during her first coherent interview, "but something remains. I feel expectant, as if we completed only the first movement of a longer composition." Elisabeth Simmons' testimony proved particularly unsettling. The young woman, whose graceful movements had captivated observers throughout the crisis, now possessed enhanced sensitivity to patterns and relationships that others could not perceive. She could predict weather changes days in advance, sense emotional states in people she had never met, and identify mathematical relationships in natural phenomena with uncanny accuracy. "The dancing taught us something," she explained, "not in words or thoughts, but in our bones, our blood, our deepest being. We learned a language that has no sounds, only movement and relationship and truth." Gutenberg's geometric analysis provided the only framework for understanding what had occurred. His final diagrams showed that the pattern created by the dancers' movements had indeed reached completion on October 15th. Yet completion had not resulted in dissolution, but rather in transformation. The physical dancing had ended, but it had apparently established something permanent, a new configuration of relationships that continued to influence the former dancers and, increasingly, the city itself. Over the following weeks, Strasbourg experienced subtle but significant changes. Trade negotiations proceeded more smoothly, as if commercial relationships had been somehow optimized. Conflicts between guildmasters resolved more easily. Even the weather seemed more favorable, with gentle rains arriving precisely when crops required moisture. Citizens began reporting unusually vivid dreams, enhanced creativity, and improved ability to understand complex problems. It was as if the completed geometric pattern had created some form of beneficial resonance that enhanced human capabilities throughout the region. Yet these improvements carried an undercurrent of unease. If unknown intelligences could manipulate human beings to create patterns that then influenced entire communities, what did such behavior suggest about human autonomy? Were the residents of Strasbourg now subject to guidance they could neither perceive nor resist? Brother Matthias completed his chronicle with more questions than answers. The dancing plague had ended, but its resolution raised more disturbing possibilities than its occurrence had. The dancers had been released from their compulsion, but they remained connected to whatever intelligence had choreographed their movements. The transformation of Strasbourg was complete, yet its nature and purpose remained a mystery. Most troubling of all, reports began arriving from other cities throughout the German states, describing unusual group behaviors. synchronized activities, and collective movements that seemed to echo Strasbourg's experience. Perhaps the dancing plague had not ended, but merely completed its initial phase, preparing for expansion into something far more comprehensive. As winter approached, Matthias sealed his manuscript in the monastery archives, hoping that future scholars might possess the knowledge necessary to understand what he had witnessed. The mystery of the dancing plague would endure long beyond the lives of those who experienced it, a testament to humanity's encounter with forces that operated according to laws not yet discovered and purposes not yet revealed. The dance had ended, but the music played on, silent, invisible, and eternally transformative.